Olá a todos e todas! Começamos aqui o nosso primeiro podcast do curso de Educação para a Cidadania Global da UNESCO. Hoje temos a honra de iniciar nosso curso de ECG com ninguém mais que um dos principais responsáveis pelo desenvolvimento da própria ECG, o professor Fernando Reimers. Fernando Reimers é professor de prática em Educação Internacional na Ford Foundation e diretor na Global Education Innovation Initiative, assim como é diretor na The International Education Policy Program na Universidade de Harvard. Seu interesse reside em ampliar a compreensão das maneiras pelas quais a escola pode capacitar estudantes para participarem cívica e economicamente e ajudar a alcançar os Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável da ONU. Ele é membro da Comissão Futuros da Educação da UNESCO. Hi, Professor Reimers. It is an honor to have you with us and to continue through this course a legacy of global citizenship education that you have contributed so much.
Freya, it's so nice to speak with you, and I'm delighted that UNESCO is sponsoring this course for Brazilian teachers to develop their skills, to educate their students as global citizenships. I cannot think of a more important thing to do at this time, so thank you.
Great. We are really happy to know that. So let's start with question number 1. We know there are several topics that we could address, but in this podcast, we would like to highlight the relationship between the concept of global citizenship and the concept of education. In your studies, you report on the growing need to form global citizens and how education has an important role to play in this task. So could you start by explaining to us this relationship between global citizenship and education in today's world?
Absolutely. I think we're living at a time when there is tremendous connection between local affairs and global affairs. The pandemic is just a very powerful reminder of that. A pandemic is expressed in very local ways, but it's also a global phenomenon. And it's very important for people to understand this connection between local and global, to not only understand events that are global in nature, but to have the skills to contribute, to participate. So I think of the civic sphere in which all of us works as one that occupies a number of concentric circles. The most immediate civic sphere, of course, is our local community. But just because we're local citizens, it doesn't mean we're also citizens of a particular state or province. And we're also citizens of a particular nation. And we're also citizens of the world. So global citizenship is the capacity to understand that connection and to be effective in participating in any of those spheres. Now, what's the connection with education? The skills that are necessary to participate can be cultivated. We're not born with those skills. And those skills encompass both cognitive skills, the capacity to understand topics that are global, whether those are climate change or poverty or trade or the impact of migration in different states or global conflicts or science, which is one of the most cosmopolitan, one of the most global activities. So there is a cognitive dimension, but there is also an interpersonal dimension to global citizenship. The capacity to relate with others that have different cultural frameworks, the capacity to put ourselves in the shoes of another person who comes from a different cultural background and to communicate and collaborate with them effectively. And there is finally an intrapersonal dimension, the capacity to know oneself, to know who we are, to manage ourselves. So global citizenship education is the process that makes it possible for every person to gradually develop those three sets of competencies, cognitive, interpersonal, and intrapersonal, which are aligned with essentially making the world better, which are aligned, if I could summarize, with advancing the Sustainable Development Goals adopted at the United Nations General Assembly in September of 2015, which, as those of us who are listening know, are goals that basically paint a view of a very inclusive world in which we all belong, in which we can relate to one another in peaceful ways, and especially in which we can relate to the planet in a way that is sustainable. addressing the very serious challenge of climate change.
Great. So in your book, Empowering Global Citizens, a World Course, one of the references we use in this course, you narrate your own experience of developing the World Course's Global Citizenship course. We would like you to share a little of this experience in the development of the Global Citizenship course and highlight which elements and factors proved to be the most important for the formulation and implementation of the program in schools.
Absolutely. So the World Course, which is a program of studies, a rigorous curriculum from kindergarten to high school, aligned initially with the Millennium Development Goals and then with the Sustainable Development Goals and with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was really the result of serendipity. I never thought I was going to write a World Course, but I was very busy doing a lot of research in the field of civic education and developing a research and practice collaborative that I lead called the Global Education Innovation Initiative, which is an effort to help transform public education so that it empowers students with the skills they need for our world. And in that context, I had written a chapter that basically said the civic education of the 21st century is global education. And I articulated what that entailed. As a result of that, I began to hear from people who were actually very interested in doing global education. And one day I got a call from a group of individuals who were creating a school, a novel school. It was going to actually be a school with campuses around the world. And they said, "We have read your article. We find it very inspiring. Could you design a world course for us?" And I was not immediately interested in doing that. I was too busy doing my research. But they said, "Listen, we are very committed to teaching this course. Why don't you do it?" I said, "Fine." And so I put together a team of graduate students, of my doctoral students, and we spent 2.5 years developing this course. And the big idea of the World Course is basically that you need to translate something like the Sustainable Development Goals into a framework of competencies in the 3 buckets that I described for you: cognitive, intrapersonal, interpersonal, but with a lot more detail. That's what took the longest time for us, more than a year. And we ended up with about 180 particular learning outcomes that students should have. Once that profile of a graduate of high school is clear, then we map backwards. We designed a curriculum that basically took the students step by step in 350 units from the first day of kindergarten until the last day of high school, so they could go from being novices to being experts in those dimensions. That's the big idea. The big idea, there are a number of people who say, "Well, you have to teach the SDGs." And I said, well, if you just teach people what the SDGs are, if you teach them to recognize the SDGs, if you teach them even to care, that doesn't mean they have the skills to advance the SDGs. You need to translate the SDGs into actual competencies. So the reason that idea, I think, was so well received is because it provided teachers with a practical tool to do something that only the most reflective educators do, which is to test the 2 hypotheses under which any curriculum is built. And those hypotheses are, if I teach A, if I engage my students in activities A or B, they're going to learn X, Y, and Z. And if my students learn X, Y, and Z, the consequences for themselves and for their communities will be 1, 2, and 3. Now, it's only the most reflective educators who take the time after they teach a course to actually say, did that actually happen? Did my students learn what I wanted them to learn? And what was the consequence for them? Now, by making that hypothesis, by making that process public, in effect, what we did was to offer teachers a methodology and a language that they could share, and that made it possible for them to test those hypotheses publicly. And as a result, it made it possible for them to collaborate, not only among various grades or various subjects in the same schools, but across many schools. And I think that's the reason why, since the book was published, just in the English version, 20,000 copies of this book have been downloaded. And the book has been translated into, to my knowledge, Portuguese. I'm very thankful to the Fundación Santillana who translated it and published it, but it's also been translated and published in Spanish, in Arabic, in Chinese, in Turkish. There may be other languages. And so I think that's the big idea. Now, the other innovation in that course is that it was built on the premise that the most powerful learning, deeper learning, happens when students engage in some kind of action that provides them an experience on which they can reflect. Because it's only when you reflect on your own experience that what you learn becomes personal knowledge that is very meaningful to you. So the course is designed, these 350 units, basically are all project-based learning. You see students from kindergarten to high school engage in a variety of activities because part of what we're trying to cultivate is agency, is the student's sense of self-efficacy, is the capacity not only to contemplate the world, but the understanding and the confidence that their actions actually matter, can make a difference. I'd say those are some of the basic principles that went into designing that. And I'm so grateful that UNESCO, as part of this course, is making this resource and other resources available to teachers. And I'm hoping that the teachers listening to us today will have the curiosity to at least browse the book and see how they can use some of these lessons that we have included there in their own teaching.
Wow, an amazing and inspiring experience for sure. So as we get into this topic of GCED, could you tell our teachers a little about the main concepts and principles of GCED, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the main competencies are, obviously, you need to have some kind of a framework guiding that. And the frameworks that we use are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Why those two? Because these are two frameworks that reflect what I think is the best institutions and thinking that we have to orient global governance. The United Nations, created at the end of World War II, exist for the very purpose of helping people collaborate across borders for the purpose of improving the world. And so that's why we use them. And obviously that's the North Star of this curriculum. But I think some of the principles, what makes our curriculum distinctive is that it is not designed to simply transmit knowledge. It is designed to build competencies. It is a competency-based curriculum. It's a curriculum designed with this framework of competencies that I have mentioned to you, and it uses pedagogies that promote deeper learning, that promote not only higher order thinking. You will see in many of the activities suggested in the book that we encourage teachers to use what's called accountable talk. Accountable talk is a talk where the students do much of the talking, but it's not just talking out of the seat of your pants. It's talking that is accountable to the facts, to knowledge, that is accountable to the group, that basically promotes the development of higher order thinking skills. You will see that there are many of these pedagogies that promote collaboration, that promote student collaboration and promote student participating in solving problems of some sort. So every grade is a sequence that ends with some kind of a performance of understanding. Now, for students in kindergarten, what the students do is they produce a puppet show. It's a puppet show that has to communicate that they understand the value of human difference, cultural difference, racial difference of any sort. But students in the second grade have a different kind of understanding. The second grade gets them to think about poverty. And you might wonder, how can a second grader think about poverty? Well, there's a way to do this that doesn't have to overwhelm the child, that engages them in activities. In fact, the second grade begins with a very simple activity. Students are asked, what games do you play? And why do you like to play those games? And they compare and contrast within the class the games they all play. And then they go and they interview their mothers or their fathers. What games did you used to play when you were a child? And they bring that information. And then they communicate with students in a different school in their own country, and they compare notes. And then they do that comparison with kids in a different country. And little by little, students go from what is immediate and personal to them to something that is more removed, more conceptual, more abstract. And finally, by the end of second grade, they are thinking about childhood and how childhood is similar and different for children of different social circumstances in the same country and for children in different countries. So these are some of the principles that we use to educate for global citizenship. It's very important. If there is one thing that I would like to emphasize in this conversation, is that we don't see global citizenship education, at least effective global citizenship education, as giving a series of speeches or transmitting content to students. We see global citizenship education as developing, cultivating the agency of the students, their sense sense of responsibility, their sense of their conviction that their actions matter, not in the future, but in the present. And I think it's out of the gradual creation of opportunities for students to see how their actions matter that their efficacy expands and expands and expands.
It's inspiring to realize the potential and importance of GCED. In this sense, teachers always think about how to make their teaching practical and inclusive, right? So in your book, Empowering Global Citizens Award course, this concern on your part is clearly perceived when making a flexible curriculum proposal and bringing countless suggestions for activities. So we bring a question. Could you give suggestions to the teachers who are listening to us about how to create or adapt curriculum and activities at GCED?
So I think that for my understanding is that the teachers listening to this program are going to be, for the most part, high school teachers. And they will be teachers teaching in different subjects. So obviously, what I would recommend is that every teacher has to see how do you construct within the subject for which you are responsible, learning opportunities for your students that are aligned with the SDGs. And I would have a practical recommendation, say for a group of teachers in a school, to create a small work group of teachers in the school, say a teacher of mathematics, a teacher of Portuguese, a teacher of history, together, and to agree to come together for about an hour, let's say once a week, to basically compare notes. And what they can do is they can actually use as a guide the world course. They can begin with the units that are there for high school. And they can see, can we integrate those units into our subjects, into the subjects that we're teaching? And can we address the same concepts through different subjects? So the world course, if you look at it, is an interdisciplinary course. It's designed to be an anchor that helps students draw on different disciplines that they are studying. And so I would hope that these multidisciplinary teams in Brazilian high schools would take these units and then ask themselves, what can I do in my subject that contributes to the advancement of the goals of these particular units? And that they would do these in collaboration with their peers. And they would design a prototype. Prototype doesn't need to be perfect and doesn't need to be the final version. It's only something to get started. So they would design a prototype. I think something that would be relatively easy would be to adapt the units that are already in the book. And then they would teach it. They would come together and they would assess how did it go. And they would make modifications and try again. And then they would come back until they basically develop a curriculum that is their own. Now, I can give you some examples which are in the book. If you look at the book for high school, the world course is basically 5 one-semester courses, very similar to a university course. So there is, for example, one course in science and technology. There is one course in economic development. There is one course in global conflicts. And there are 2 other courses. I forget the specifics right now. And then in addition to the courses, students are asked to engage either in an internship, in a workplace, or in a laboratory, because we think that providing students the opportunity to be in a work setting when they are in high school is a wonderful way for them to see the connections between what they're learning in school and the demands of the world outside of school. So my hope is that every high school student graduates having taken at least one internship in a work-related setting. So that would be my invitation to the Brazilian. Now, the internship, as we explained in the world course, might be different. For those students who have an interest in the sciences, the internship could be an internship in a laboratory, in a science lab. For students who are interested in business, the internship could be spending some hours a week working in a company, in a business, and so on and so forth. Now, you will see in the course that there are activities that the students are expected to produce. So that would be my invitation to the teachers that are listening to us for the kinds of things they could do. For example, I think it's in middle school, the students are taught how to create a business, how to basically write the business plan of a company. And throughout the semester, they learn to do that. Very, very powerful experience. This is something that you could try in Brazil. You could try anywhere. Your teachers could say, why don't we take our students and get them, for example, to think about one of the SDGs. So that means they have to study the SDGs and then decide which SDG do they want to work on. And then they say, what product could we create that would help advance this SDG? The product could be a service, service, it could be a consumable, it could be a technology. And then once they design the product, they could think about how do we now design an enterprise that can help us advance the product. That experience, that type of experiential learning is very, very powerful. Let me share with the audience how I apply that into my own teaching. I've been teaching at Harvard for more than 20 years. And I've always had a very strong interest in how education can help disadvantaged students, poor students, develop the skills that will help them get out of poverty. So I used to teach a course called Education, Poverty, and Inequality. It was a very important course to me because it connected to my own intellectual interest. But the course had the effect of depressing me a little bit and depressing the students. It's almost as if you study a problem very deeply, and you realize how difficult it is to solve the problem. So I would teach this course on a Friday morning, and Friday afternoon I would be flat, totally overwhelmed. And I think my students were too. And so one year I decided to do something different. As part of another innovation I had created at Harvard, a program to develop entrepreneurs, I had begun to write case studies of people who were developing innovations to provide educational opportunities to poor children, essentially people who were creating programs. And so I took those case studies and I introduced them in the course. And so the last third of that course on education and poverty was basically studying people who were trying to solve the problem. And I observed that that piece of the course made me a lot more hopeful and happier, and also made my students a lot more hopeful and happier. And so that I made that decision, I think this was about 13 years ago, that I was no longer going to teach my course. I replaced that course with a course called Educational Innovation and Social Entrepreneurship. I basically am still interested in preparing students to understand how to tackle the problems of poverty through education, but I do it in a different way. The students come here and I say, what are you going to do about the problem? And throughout a semester, I help them basically develop the business plan of an organization that is going to address poverty through education. And that's my invitation for the teachers who are listening, that you can use similar principles. And of course, when you design a course of that sort, you have to draw on many different disciplines to develop a good company. You have to use good science. You have to use history. You have to use what you're learning in math and so on. But because you have a real context and applied setting in which you're using those things, you understand those subjects much more deeply than if you just study them in the abstract. That would be my invitation. And so in the book, there are many examples of how to do this.
Wow, perfect. I think this example was very clear to everyone who's listening to us right now. So undoubtedly, we could spend hours talking with Professor Reimers, but unfortunately, we have to end our episode now. So thank you so much, Professor, for your time and mostly for sharing your gigantic knowledge and experience with us. It was an honor to have you as our first podcast guest. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Freya. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I'm delighted that you are helping UNESCO support teachers in Brazil. I think that this particular moment, when the pandemic has caused so much suffering in Brazil and around the world, is a very unique moment in which we need to accelerate our efforts in global citizenship. And the reason is the following. The pandemic has obviously caused a lot of deaths. It has caused a lot of harm, economic harm for people. It has had a very unequal impact. It has affected mostly the most disadvantaged members of society. And with that, the pandemic is going to have very destabilizing effects in societies. To give you an example, in the United States, every 4 years, the National Defense Council produces a report for every new president on the main risks facing the nation. And the report this year talks about the risk of social fragmentation accelerated by the pandemic. I was reading this morning a similar report produced by the European intelligence agencies say that extremely intolerant groups, hate groups, terrorist groups are growing in the context of the pandemic. So there is something about the pandemic that is very destabilizing. Obviously, the need to advance a world in which we provide opportunities for the most marginalized, in which we contribute to reduce poverty, to advance equality, in which we create well-being for all, and in which we relate to the planet in ways that are sustainable is really urgent. And those things are only going to happen if each and every one of us takes responsibility to do our share. And what I think students can do in schools is cultivate their own capacity to build that world. And what their teachers can do is help their students develop those capacities to build a better world. And that, in a nutshell, is global citizenship. So what you are doing and what UNESCO is doing is very important, is very timely, and I'm delighted to have been a part